Hello everybody, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. We're talking about the merging of narrative or lore with mechanics, and a term that I like to call realistic fiction. But first, thank you to 664 subscribers up there on YouTube. Hope you're enjoying the content, and we don't get stuck on 666, because I don't need any more bad luck than what I already have. For today's topic, realistic fiction is a term that I use to describe where a game, an animated series, movie, whatever, may operate in a fantasy or fictitious setting, but still operates within its own set of rules or structure. And it can be a little confusing to say that, and the terms fiction and realism tend to be a contradiction. But there are several examples of how this can work, not just in video games, but in other mediums. My little example here is, of course, The Simpsons. This is Season 1, and I could easily dedicate a critical thought to The Simpsons by itself. But The Simpsons, at least for the first decade, and we can argue when things decided to change, operated within very much a grounded sense of real life. These characters and situations pretty much played off of a real-world setting. The only thing was it was an animated show. And many of the older episodes, you could pretty much take real actors and play it out. Now, what the writers and the makers of The Simpsons talk about in many of the commentary tracks is how they stretch the rules to add those comedic elements or those strange situations, bringing in the cartoon elements for like a few seconds. Could be jumping Springfield Gorge, Homer getting hurt, and some of the crazier situations that happen in Springfield. But the point is that the show still operated within a basis in reality, or a basis in real-world situations and rules. Now, when it comes to video games, and even other animated series, things can tend to fall apart when the writers and the people responsible don't go far enough in establishing these rules of the world. And a great example would be many lesser quality animated series will say they take place in a fantasy setting or a setting that's not supposed to be our Earth. But they'll still fill it with things from our life, essentially. Whether it be product placement, slang, people's attempt to be hip. And it just feels like a clash. When it comes to video games, you have the added measure of mechanics on top of the lore and the world building. And there is one very big perpetrator of failing realistic fiction. And that, of course, is Final Fantasy. Anyone who's played the Final Fantasy series should know what is about to be discussed. Final Fantasy takes place in a world full of power and war and love and loss and trying to save everyone from extinction and all kinds of grandiose stories. And yet there's an item you can buy from the store for a few bucks that brings people back to life. How is that supposed to make sense within the lore? Why should we care about any of these characters when a Phoenix Down will basically solve everything? Likewise, why should there be any conflict when you have summons that can magically appear these giant creatures that do thousands upon thousands of damage? It doesn't make sense, and it's a clash. From a mechanic point of view, there's also the clash with how they give you abilities. The Final Fantasy series is infamous for having all kinds of status effects and powers that really don't do all that much. Either characters will resist it has such a low chance of happening, or it's so weak that there's just no point in doing it. For instance, why should I take the time to petrify an enemy or lower his attack when I can instead use my turn doing massive damage with my strongest spell? Some RPGs tend to go the other way and make these spells really, really powerful, such as in Etrian Odyssey and the Shin Megami Tensei games. But the point is, when you're trying to establish your own world, your own settings, you need to think about how these things work. For instance, if I'm writing a story that takes place in a world where everyone has 3 heads on their shoulders, then I shouldn't expect to have doors that are the exact same way they are on Earth, or hats that are the same. That would make no sense, because this world has evolved differently. And I know what you're thinking right now. This does seem like a very much like nitpicking stories, and the quote-unquote "it's just a game." But as we've seen time and time and again, some of the best defined games and some of the most memorable ones establish their world and have mechanics and lore coalesce together. Whether this is in the form of BioShock, with building this world around the tonics and Atom, and then seeing how this would play out. But for a lot of video games, they tend to struggle with going all the way in this regard. Another classic example would be any game where you have a limit, but the enemies don't. For instance, the ever classic enemy has infinite number of rockets, I grab his rocket launcher, now I'm restricted to 10. Now, many game designers do this obviously to basically put the game in front of realism. And that is a very important point. And part of being a good designer is knowing how far to essentially stretch realism in favor of gameplay or enjoyment. And we can look at any first-person shooter in the last 5 years as an example of this. Probably even longer than that. If first-person shooters like Call of Duty or Battlefield or Medal of Honor were striving for realism, they would all basically be over in 10 seconds. The second you get shot, you're dead. You're not going to stand behind a wall and magically let that bullet wound heal. And it's one of the compromises we see with game development. The fact that games are very much not real life. And there's a classic example of this I like to bring up whenever we talk about realistic fiction. In the game Sid Meier's Pirates, which was a open-ended game where you basically become a pirate during the Age of Sail. Sid Meier talked about in a developer interview or a developer commentary how there was the pull to add more realistic elements to the game. Obviously, scurvy was a major threat to living on the high seas during that time, and they were toying around with having the player have to either return to port or carry a supply of vitamin C with them, or the player would be punished by losing crew due to disease and scurvy. But what they decided on was basically saying that those realistic elements, while realistically and historically accurate, were getting in the way of playing the game, and so they removed them. And it's always a very interesting push and pull between how much realism you want to have with the game and how much you don't, or how much of the fantasy elements basically override real life. And it's very hard, and every game is different. Going to Mario Galaxy up there, the Mario games obviously have no sense of realism. This is a world where if you run, you somehow gain the ability to do a double jump in the air, or a world where stars can be picked up and used for keys. But what Mario does, and what has been a part of all the Mario games, is instead establish a sense of realistic fiction. Nothing in the Mario games will ever happen in real life, but they're grounded within their own unique and fantastical set of laws and rules that govern that world. Now, another added point when it comes to mechanics and game design is you don't want to break your own rules. If you tell me that fire damage works on zombies, let's say, you don't want to then say, oh, we're not going to throw enemies or zombies that are immune to fire. That would essentially break your own rule. And we see a lot of games struggle with adding challenge and complexity by essentially going back on their rule schemes. There are so many examples of games, probably more that I've forgotten by now, of games where, let's say you play the majority of the game using your gun, and it's a third-person shooter. And then they'll throw in a boss who basically is immune to bullets. So now you have to rely on using your fists. But that was never an option before, and may never be an option afterwards. That would be an example of you essentially breaking your own mechanics. Now, one final part about realistic fiction, then we'll wrap this up. a common strategy, and we see this with movies, TV shows, film, etc., is to have the quote-unquote the story Bible. And the Bible essentially tells you or establishes the rules for the world, tells how people should react, gives an idea of how this world should work. If we're in a world where rain is made out of chocolate, then the world should be built to establish what that would be like. And I've thought about games and stories like this in the past. Like, imagine a world where there is no sun. How would things have evolved? How would things change from there? And it's a very interesting test, or a way to see how well your imagination works. By imagining worlds like this and going just beyond saying, oh, everyone, let's say everyone has longer legs. Like, start imagining what would that be like if everyone was 5 to 10 feet taller. What would that mean for buildings? What would that mean for clothing? What would that mean for fashion? You never know. And the more you think about these, how the lore and how the setting is grounded by that, the better you'll become as a storyteller. And that can also translate into your game designs. Because once you start thinking about the lore, that lore can become essentially a guide or a solution to your mechanics. If you're having trouble thinking about what kind of mechanics have in your game or how you want someone to react, just go back to your Bible, or to your storytelling Bible, and look at what you've devised as the rules of this world. And you can sort of use that to then build this world around it. And a lot of RPGs have gone this route, especially those in the older school sense, when they have these mysterious and fantasy worlds, and then because they're not, I guess, held to, major graphical engines and all the art and stuff like that, they can get really crazy with devising, okay, if we have a world where everyone can summon monsters, or a world where everyone turns into a werewolf at night, how can we show that in this game? How can this world be built around that? And this can apply to not just video games, but as I said, to any other medium. We are trying to create an interesting story or an interesting setting. But that is going to do it for today's Critical Thought. Like I said, you can look at The Simpsons as an example. I have a few more of these DVDs downstairs. And like I said, it wouldn't take much for me to dedicate an entire Critical Thought to The Simpsons. But as I said, when it comes to realistic fiction, the shows and the games that work this the best tend to be the most memorable. And while you can use the excuse of it's just a game, that is usually a telltale sign that the designer or the writer didn't do a good enough job. If you just say it's just a game when you're talking about lore, it's not a good excuse. And again, great stories will tend to have a but, or they'll be able to ground it within their own fiction. But we're going to wrap it up here. I guess this is normal time for a Critical Thought, but it seems less than my other ones as of late. So, as always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy them. And I will see you all tomorrow with my next Critical Thought. And other than that, have a great rest of Friday and great weekend. See you all then. Take care. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment, of course, share with your friends. It always helps out. Check out game-wisdom.com, where I examine the art and science of games. You can follow me on Twitch and Twitter under GW Bycer for the latest updates of new content. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign. You can find us on Patreon under Game Wisdom, if you would like to donate and help contribute to keeping Game Wisdom going. Your donations can not only give us the monthly funding we need to keep supporting ourselves, but if we can hit some goals, it will mean more great content for you, and there are some nifty little rewards there as well. Thanks for watching this video, and be sure to tune into the next one real soon.